Hey up. Have you ever wondered how come most of the northern mill towns have become chock-a-block with Pakistanis or people of Pakistani descent? The answer's fairly straightforward. It's twofold. First of all, it's the law of unintended consequences in action. And secondly, it's to do with the eternal desire of British capitalists to screw the working man out of as much of his wages as they can. Let's look at this. 1962, Parliament passed a piece of legislation called the Commonwealth Immigration Act. Now, this was designed to stop I suspect it was designed to stop blacks, mainly from the West Indies, coming over to Britain, which of course they could do when those territories were still part of the empire. But once they became independent, and Jamaica became independent in 1962, Parliament decided that here was a wonderful opportunity to keep the numbers down. Parliament being Parliament, of course, they messed it up. And what they did was open the door not for Jamaicans, but for Pakistanis. Because the legislation has a couple of get out clauses. It does say that citizens of independent Commonwealth lands cannot settle in Britain freely. They could before this legislation. However, it gave a couple of get out clauses. First, if you were a skilled worker, a plumber, a joiner, an electrician, then you had free access to Britain. But more importantly, for our point of view, is that if you were an unskilled worker or semi-skilled, and you had a letter from a recognized British company offering you a job, then you got free access to Britain. That was all you needed, the letter. So, needless to say, when this legislation was passed, the mill owners began to look to Pakistan to recruit the next generation of labourers at a rate that was lower than was being paid at the time. Let me just go off on a tangent for a moment. The mill towns have worked or had worked for many decades on the principle of the going rate. The going rate for the job, and everybody knew what the going rate was. And no employer would offer a rate of pay that was lower than the going rate, partly because the unions wouldn't accept it, but also because the workers wouldn't accept it. Those mill towns, by the end of the 1950s, were chock-a-block, not just with British and Irish people, but also Ukrainians, Poles, Germans, people who'd fetched up in Britain for whatever reason in 1945 and had no home to go back to, so they stayed. And the mill towns were the easiest places to go to get a job one day for the next. But those new people may not have spoken English, but what English they did speak served them in good stead. They understood the going rate. So they couldn't use Germans and Ukrainians and Poles to cut the wages because the Germans, Ukrainians, and Poles wouldn't wear it. so they had to look elsewhere. Now, the going rate in, say, Nelson, Lancashire, where I have family, in the early 1960s for working the night shift in a mill, be it cotton or woolen, was £8 a week. That's not £8 an hour, it's not £8 a day, it's £8 a week. That was the going rate, and that was what the mills offered, because nobody would take any less. So some clever bugger in one company, Smith and Nephew, decided that they would reduce the rate to £7 a week, and they sent agents over to Pakistan to look for workers who would work for £7 a week. Now, other companies were doing the same thing. So why bother going to throughout the whole of Pakistan when some companies already have agents in one particular region? It was in the north of the country. So this carried on. Smith and Nephew sent their agents to that particular region, the Punjab. It was that area. And they had their letters, and all that they needed to do was put the name of the new worker on each letter, offering him the job. He then got himself a nice Pakistani passport, and with his letter, he came over to Britain, was waved through by immigration, came to Nelson, and started work the following week, or day even. That's fine, until the unions discovered this, and all hell broke loose. So what the unions did was really very clever. Again, these workers didn't speak English, but they didn't trust the employer any more than we did. So a union recruiting them, it was fertile ground. And quickly the Pakistani workers were recruited into the union, and there were strikes and threats of strikes. So they had to raise the rate of pay for the Pakistanis to the going rate, which puts a stop to the capitalists and their tricks. Pretty soon, the Labour government, which came into office in '64, introduced a Race Relations Act, which made it illegal to pay workers a different rate of pay based on their ethnicity. But nevertheless, that is the reason why the mill towns, Nelson, Burnley, wherever, are chock full of Pakistanis, because the mill owners wanted to cut the wages. They couldn't do it with anybody who had a European attitude towards trade unions and the employer. So they looked for peasants in northern Pakistan, found them, and for a year or so, they managed to keep the wages down. After that, when they couldn't, the wages went back up, and management needed some other ploy to increase the bottom line. Eventually, they just gave up, abandoned their mills, and abandoned the workers that they brought over. And that, ladies and gentlemen, is why there are so many Pakistanis in Lancashire and Yorkshire today. Think on, folks.